Hollywood has always been a land of dreams, a place where movie screens flicker with perfect romances, glittering gowns, and carefully constructed happy endings. For decades, the studio system sold the world an illusion, stories that weren't just confined to the silver screen, but that extended to the very lives of its stars. The public was told that their favorite actresses were living fairy tale marriages, that they were wholesome, glamorous, and endlessly devoted to their leading men. But behind the bright lights and polished magazine covers, another story was quietly unfolding. It was a story of secrecy, of longing, of love that could not be spoken out loud. For many actresses of old Hollywood, their greatest roles weren't in front of the camera, but in hiding the truth of who they really were and who they really loved. In the golden age of Hollywood, from the 1930s to the 1950s, the studios were powerful beyond imagination. They didn't just control the films that were made, they controlled the personal lives of their stars. Publicists crafted biographies, staged romances, and even arranged marriages to keep up appearances. Contracts often included morality clauses that could end a career overnight if a star's private life was deemed scandalous. And at that time, queerness was considered the ultimate scandal. A whisper about an actress being too close to another woman could ruin box office returns, alienate advertisers, and destroy reputations. So the studios did what they always did best. They covered it up. Affairs were denied. Friendships were exaggerated, and love stories between women were buried beneath a carefully constructed facade. Yet even in the shadows, love persisted. Many of the brightest names in Hollywood carried on secret relationships, expressing themselves only in coded letters, in private gatherings, or in the protective company of like-minded friends. Their truth had to be hidden, but it was never completely erased. And within this hidden world, there existed something whispered about in hushed tones, the so-called sewing circle. It wasn't an official club or a public society, but rather a loose network of women in Hollywood who loved women. It included actresses, writers, and creatives who found refuge in each other's company, away from the watchful eyes of gossip columnists and studio heads. For them, sewing wasn't the activity. It was a cold word, a way of disguising the true nature of their private gatherings. In these secret spaces, they could breathe freely, love openly, and share the pieces of themselves the public was never allowed to see. This is the story of those women. Some whose relationships were only whispered about, others whose private letters and admissions later revealed the truth. They were icons, legends, and trailblazers, but also vulnerable human beings who had to hide the most personal part of their identity in order to survive an industry built on illusions. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the untold stories of 10 Hollywood actresses whose love lives were erased, rewritten, or silenced by the studios. Their names may be familiar: Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Tallulah Bankhead, Barbara Stanwyck, Katharine Hepburn, Mercedes Acosta, Alla Nazimova, Patsy Kelly and Harding, and Joan Crawford. But the stories we're about to share reveal a side of them Hollywood never wanted you to see. Because behind every red carpet smile and every carefully posed publicity photo, there were secrets. Secrets that carried risks, secrets that could end careers, but also secrets that spoke of courage and authenticity in a time when love had to be hidden. And now, decades later, it's time to tell those stories. Greta Garbo's story begins not in Hollywood, but in Stockholm, Sweden, where she was born in 1905 as Greta Lovisa Gustafsson. Her path to stardom seemed unlikely. Raised in poverty, shy, and intensely private, Garbo initially worked in a department store before being discovered for her striking beauty and magnetic screen presence. By the early 1920s, she was studying at the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm, but fate had bigger plans. She caught the attention of MGM executives and was brought to the United States in 1925, at just 20 years old, to begin her career in Hollywood. What followed was the rise of a legend. Garbo became a sensation almost immediately, appearing in silent films like Torn and Flesh and the Devil, where her smoldering presence captivated audiences and established her as one of MGM's brightest stars. The arrival of sound in cinema could have ended her career, as it did for many foreign-born actors with thick accents, but Garbo defied the odds. Her first talking picture, Anna Christie in 1930, was a triumph, advertised with the tagline "Garbo Talks." The film introduced audiences to her husky, alluring voice, which only added to her mystique. From there, her career soared. She starred in Grand Hotel alongside Joan Crawford, delivered a regal performance in Queen Christina, and gave unforgettable turns in Camille and Ninotchka. By the mid-1930s, she wasn't just a star, she was an institution. Fans adored her, critics praised her, and MGM promoted her as a divine Garbo, a title that spoke to her near-mythical status. But as much as the public adored her, Garbo was unlike any other actress of her time. She refused to play the Hollywood publicity game. Where others courted attention, she avoided it. She shunned interviews, skipped premieres, and declined fan clubs. Her most famous quote, "I want to be alone," became both her mantra and her legend. While some saw aloofness, others saw authenticity, a woman unwilling to sacrifice herself for the machinery of fame. Yet this desire for privacy also provided a shield, one that protected the parts of her life she could never share publicly. Behind the veil of mystery was a woman who loved deeply and privately, often outside the boundaries of what society would accept. Among her most important and enduring relationships was with playwright and poet Mercedes Acosta. Their bond was intense, emotional, and, as revealed in letters that later came to light, deeply affectionate. In these private writings, Garbo expressed longing, intimacy, and a vulnerability rarely glimpsed in her public life. The surviving correspondence suggests more than friendship. It suggests a love that had to exist in the shadows, carefully hidden from an industry and a world that would never have allowed it to exist openly. The Acosta herself was known for her relationships with women, including Marlene Dietrich and Alla Nazimova, and it was through her that Garbo connected to a hidden network of queer women in Hollywood. For Garbo, whose every move was scrutinized, these private moments were perhaps her truest self. MGM, meanwhile, did everything in its power to preserve her carefully crafted image. The studio promoted her as mysterious, untouchable, and above scandal, while working tirelessly to suppress gossip that might threaten her reputation. Her intense relationships with women were disguised as close friendships, and any whispers were silenced by a press system that depended on MGM's power. Garbo's privacy wasn't just her own choice. It was a necessity, a survival strategy in a system that punished anyone who deviated from the straight and narrow roles Hollywood demanded. When Garbo retired in 1941, at just 36 years old, the world was stunned. At the height of her fame, she simply walked away. Unlike many of her contemporaries who clung to the spotlight, she disappeared into a life of solitude in New York City, rarely giving interviews or making public appearances again. For the next 5 decades, she lived reclusively, walking the streets of Manhattan, visiting museums, and spending time with a small circle of trusted friends. She never married, never had children, and never explained her decision to abandon Hollywood. This silence only added to her legend, leaving the world to wonder who she truly was. Today, Greta Garbo is remembered not only as one of the greatest actresses of all time, but also as a queer icon. Whether or not she ever publicly acknowledged her love for women, the evidence in her letters and the testimony of those who knew her make it clear that her heart could not be contained by the roles the world wanted her to play. Her independence, her refusal to conform, and her insistence on privacy were revolutionary in an industry built on control and illusion. Greta Garbo lived life on her own terms, and in doing so, she left behind a legacy that continues to inspire anyone who has ever had to keep their true self hidden. Marlene Dietrich's story begins in Berlin, where she was born in 1901, long before she would become one of Hollywood's most enduring symbols of glamour, rebellion, and reinvention. Her early years were steeped in music and performance. She studied violin and voice before turning to acting, first appearing in German silent films during the 1920s. Her breakout came in 1930 with The Blue Angel, directed by Joseph von Sternberg. Playing the sultry cabaret singer Lola Lola, Dietrich captivated audiences with her smoky voice, magnetic presence, and daring sexuality. The film was an international success, and Hollywood took notice. She signed with Paramount Pictures and, alongside von Sternberg, launched a career that would make her one of the most iconic stars of the 20th century. In Hollywood, Dietrich was marketed as the ultimate exotic seductress, but she was far more complex than the roles she played. In Morocco, 1930, her first American film, she stunned audiences not just with her beauty, but with her boldness. In one of cinema's most legendary moments, Dietrich appeared in a tuxedo, top hat, and bow tie, crooning to the audience and then stealing a kiss from another woman on screen. This was 1930, an era when same-sex affection was taboo even in private life, let alone on screen. The scene cemented Dietrich as a rule breaker, someone who dared to blur the lines of gender and desire in ways few others could. Films like Shanghai Express, 1932, and Desire, 1936, further established her as Hollywood royalty, while her partnership with von Sternberg became legendary, producing some of the most visually stunning films of the era. Off-screen, Dietrich cultivated a persona as daring as her roles. She became famous for her love of men's clothing, often appearing in tuxedos and tailored suits at public events. While Hollywood starlets were expected to exude hyperfemininity, Dietrich reveled in androgyny, embracing styles that were provocative, stylish, and deeply subversive for the time. She made the tuxedo glamorous for women, transforming what might have been scandal into high fashion. Her ability to bend gender expectations made her a style icon, not just for her generation, but for countless others who followed. Her personal life was just as unconventional. Dietrich had affairs with men. Her marriage to Rudolf Sieber lasted in name for decades, and she had relationships with powerful figures like director Joseph von Sternberg and actor John Gilbert. But she also had relationships with women, including rumored romances with Greta Garbo, Mercedes Acosta, and even French singer Edith Piaf. Though rarely confirmed publicly, these liaisons became part of her legend. She lived her life with a fluidity that defied the rigid labels of her era. Where others concealed, she seemed to embrace contradiction. The studios, however, understood the risk. While Dietrich's eccentricity and androgyny were tolerated, sometimes even celebrated as part of her allure, her relationships with women were never openly acknowledged. Paramount promoted her as a glamorous star with exotic appeal, carefully glossing over the queerer aspects of her identity. Gossip columns might hint, insiders might whisper, but the official story remained one of a heterosexual siren. This balancing act allowed Dietrich to push boundaries while still maintaining her place in Hollywood's hierarchy. Beyond her acting career, Dietrich's influence extended into politics and culture. During World War II, she became a symbol of resistance, performing for Allied troops and lending her voice to anti-Nazi broadcasts. Her decision to renounce her German citizenship and become an American citizen in 1939 cemented her legacy not just as an entertainer, but as a figure of courage and conviction. After the war, she reinvented herself again, touring the world as a singer, dazzling audiences with her glamour and her smoky renditions of classic songs. Marlene Dietrich's legacy is one of defiance. On screen, she portrayed women who were seductive, complex, and often morally ambiguous. Off-screen, she embodied independence, embracing fashion and relationships that challenged every social expectation of her time. By wearing tuxedos, by kissing women on screen, and by living life on her own terms, she redefined femininity in Hollywood. She became an icon for anyone who refused to be confined by society's rules, and her androgynous style continues to inspire artists, musicians, and designers to this day. She may never have stood at a podium and declared her sexuality, but she didn't have to. Her choices, her clothes, her roles, her loves, spoke louder than any words could. Marlene Dietrich didn't just survive Hollywood's restrictions. She bent them to her will, leaving behind a legacy of glamour, rebellion, and unapologetic individuality. Tallulah Bankhead was one of those rare performers who could light up a stage or screen simply by walking into a room. Born in Alabama in 1902, she was the daughter of a prominent political family, but instead of following a traditional path, she set her sights on the theater. She rose to prominence in London during the 1920s, winning over British audiences with her magnetic stage presence, wit, and the kind of Southern drawl that made her instantly recognizable. By the time she returned to the United States, she had already become a name to watch, and Hollywood soon came calling. Her performances in films like Lifeboat 1944, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, solidified her reputation as an actress of substance, though she was often more famous for her offstage antics than her on-screen work. Tallulah's voice was one of her trademarks, a husky, smoky tone that seemed to carry both seduction and defiance. It became part of her legend, much like her razor-sharp wit. She was known for her biting one-liners, outrageous comments, and complete lack of inhibition. Bankhead never seemed to censor herself, whether in interviews, at parties, or even on stage. She relished in shocking people, and in a time when Hollywood stars were expected to be polished, well-mannered products of the studio system, Tallulah stood out as a scandalous diva who couldn't be contained. But it wasn't just her sharp tongue and extravagant lifestyle that made her infamous. It was her love life. Tallulah was known to have relationships with both men and women, and she was remarkably open about it, especially considering the era in which she lived. In fact, she once quipped that she had slept with more women than men, a declaration that was both shocking and liberating in the conservative climate of early Hollywood. While many of her contemporaries hid their same-sex relationships behind layers of secrecy, Tallulah leaned into her reputation, using it as part of her public persona. One of the most direct confirmations of her relationships with women came from actress Patsy Kelly. Kelly, who herself was openly lesbian in Hollywood, a rare thing at the time, stated outright that she and Bankhead had been lovers. In an industry where secrecy was everything, Kelly's honesty was almost unheard of. Their connection added fuel to the fire Tallulah's already notorious image, but also demonstrated the way she refused to play by anyone else's rules. Her affairs with men were just as legendary. She was linked to actors, producers, and countless high-profile figures, but her relationships with women were the ones that challenged Hollywood's carefully maintained image of heteronormativity. And while the studios often tried to downplay or ignore those parts of her life, Tallulah's flamboyance made it nearly impossible to contain. If someone hinted at scandal, Tallulah often fanned the flames herself with a witty remark or an outrageous story. This openness, however, was a double-edged sword. While many admired her boldness and refusal to conform, others saw her as reckless, scandalous, even dangerous. In an era when actresses could be blacklisted for even a hint of impropriety, Tallulah somehow managed to survive, though often more as a cult figure than a mainstream box office draw. Her larger-than-life personality kept her in the public eye, even when the roles didn't always follow. By the later years of her career, Tallulah had become a symbol of camp, her flamboyance, wit, and scandalous reputation making her a favorite among queer audiences long before Hollywood embraced such fandoms openly. She hosted radio shows, appeared on stage, and continued to shock and delight with her personality, if not always with consistent acting work. She embraced the wild image that society gave her, perhaps because it was one of the few ways she could live authentically in a time that wanted to silence her truth. Tallulah Bankhead's legacy is one of defiance, humor, and fearless authenticity. While the studios and gossip columns may have tried to cast her personal life as scandal, she reclaimed it as part of her identity. She lived loudly, flamboyantly, and unapologetically, refusing to let Hollywood or society at large decide how she should behave or whom she should love. Today, she is remembered not only as a great actress and wit, but also as a queer icon, someone who dared to live openly in an era defined by silence. Barbara Stanwyck was one of the most prolific and respected actresses of Hollywood's golden age, remembered for her sharp intelligence, natural style, and ability to inhabit almost any role with effortless conviction. Born Ruby Catherine Stevens in Brooklyn in 1907, her early life was marked by hardship. Orphaned at a young age, she grew up tough and resilient, traits that would later inform many of her screen performances. By her late teens, she had already worked as a chorus girl and found her way into acting. Unlike many of her contemporaries who relied on glamour alone, Stanwyck's strength was her raw talent, her emotional honesty, and a magnetic screen presence that made audiences believe her every word. Her career spanned 4 decades and nearly 100 films. She was unforgettable in Stella Dallas, 1937, earning her first Academy Award nomination for her heartbreaking performance as a working-class mother sacrificing everything for her daughter. In The Lady Eve, 1941, she displayed her comedic chops with razor-sharp timing opposite Henry Fonda, while in Double Indemnity, 1944, she gave one of film noir's defining performances as a coldly calculating femme fatale Phyllis Dietrich's son. From screwball comedies to gritty dramas, Stanwyck could do it all, which is why she was often called a tough girl of the screen. She played women who were smart, independent, and often one step ahead of the men around her, a persona that resonated strongly with audiences. Off-screen, Barbara Stanwyck's life was far more guarded. She married twice. First to vaudeville performer Frank Fay, a troubled union that ended in divorce, and then to actor Robert Taylor, one of MGM's most handsome leading men. The second marriage, in particular, was heavily publicized, promoted by the studio as a glamorous Hollywood love story. MGM was careful to present Stanwyck and Taylor as the perfect couple, hard-working, devoted, and respectable. But behind the carefully constructed narrative, whispers persisted. For decades, rumors circulated about Stanwyck's relationships with women, though never publicly confirmed. Hollywood insiders speculated about her closeness with other actresses and women in the industry. Some even suggested that her marriage to Taylor had been orchestrated, or at least heavily encouraged, by MGM as a way of deflecting attention from her private life. The studio had a vested interest in maintaining her image as a wholesome yet sophisticated leading lady. Any hint of scandal, especially rumors about same-sex relationships, could have derailed her career at its peak. Unlike Tallulah Bankhead, who openly flaunted her affairs with women, Stanwyck kept her private life intensely secret. Friends described her as guarded and wary of being vulnerable, a habit likely born from her difficult childhood and the constant pressure of the studio system. While gossip columnists occasionally hinted at her sexuality, concrete evidence never surfaced. The closest thing to confirmation was circumstantial, her choice of close companions, her reluctance to remarry after her divorce from Taylor, and the frequency with which her name appeared in whispered Hollywood conversations about the sewing circle. The secrecy surrounding Stanwyck was both a shield and a prison. On one hand, it allowed her to continue working without scandal destroying her career. On the other, it meant she could never fully live openly as herself. The strength and independence she projected on screen may have been, in part, an extension of the self-reliance she cultivated in real life, always keeping the most personal part of herself locked away. As Hollywood evolved, so did Stanwyck. She successfully transitioned into television, winning acclaim for her role in The Big Valley in the 1960s. She continued working into her later years, earning respect as one of the most enduring actresses of her generation. Yet even as she received awards and tributes for her extraordinary career, the questions about her private life never entirely disappeared. Barbara Stanwyck's legacy is that of a consummate professional, a woman who worked tirelessly, carved out a career that spanned genres and decades, and helped define what it meant to be a strong female presence in Hollywood. She was tough, resilient, and endlessly versatile. And while her personal truth was obscured by a protective shield of the studio system, the very rumors that once threatened her image have now made her an enduring queer icon. For many, she represents the thousands of women in Hollywood who were forced to hide their love, who lived behind carefully constructed facades, and who found ways to survive in a system determined to silence them. Katharine Hepburn was, in many ways, the embodiment of independence in Hollywood. Born in Connecticut in 1907 to progressive parents, her mother a suffragist and her father a doctor, Hepburn grew up with an unusual degree of freedom for a young woman of her era. This foundation shaped the persona she would later cultivate on screen. Self-assured, athletic, sharp, and unwilling to conform to expectations. She first rose to prominence in the 1930s, quickly distinguishing herself with her clipped New England accent and commanding presence. Films like Bringing Up Baby, 1938, The Philadelphia Story, 1940, and later The African Queen, 1951, cemented her as one of Hollywood's greatest leading ladies. Over her career, she earned a staggering 4 Academy Awards for Best Actress, a record that still stands. What set Hepburn apart was not just her talent, but her refusal to play Hollywood's game. At a time when actresses were expected to appear in gowns, heels, and carefully cultivated feminine images, Hepburn famously wore trousers, shirts, and flat shoes both on and off screen. She was athletic, fond of tennis, swimming, and outdoor adventure, and seemed to delight in defying conventions that governed the lives of her contemporaries. This refusal to conform earned her the label of eccentric, but also became part of her appeal. To audiences, she represented a kind of liberated modern woman who wasn't afraid to stand apart. Publicly, her great love story was with Spencer Tracy. Their relationship, which spanned over 2 decades, became one of Hollywood's most famous romances. Yet it was carefully shielded from public view, not least because Tracy remained married throughout their time together, though separated from his wife. Hepburn rarely spoke about him publicly, and their connection was treated by the studios as an open secret. The pairing provided Hepburn with traditional narrative, devoted woman, loyal partner, that reassured audiences and insulated her from deeper scrutiny. But beneath this polished image lay more complexity. Biographers and historians have long speculated that Hepburn had relationships with women, particularly in her younger years. One of the most notable figures in her private life was Laura Harding, a wealthy socialite and heiress with whom Hepburn lived for several years in the 1930s. Their closeness was profound, and Harding reportedly referred to herself as Hepburn's husband. Later in life, Hepburn also had a long relationship with Phyllis Wilburn, her devoted secretary and companion, who remained by her side for over 40 years. While never openly acknowledged as romantic, these relationships suggest deep intimacy and connection that went far beyond friendship. Hepburn herself contributed to the ambiguity. She was fiercely private, refusing interviews for much of her career and bristling at questions about her personal life. This guardedness, combined with her unconventional style, created fertile ground for speculation. Yet the studio system, ever protective of its stars, was quick to frame her independence as harmless eccentricity rather than evidence of a private truth. The narrative of the tomboy actress, who simply preferred trousers over dresses, allowed the public to embrace her uniqueness without confronting the possibility of her queerness. Her resilience and determination carried her through periods of both triumph and decline. After being labeled box office poison in the late 1930s, she engineered her own comeback by buying the rights to the Philadelphia story and using it as her vehicle back to stardom. This business savvy only reinforced the image of Hepburn as fiercely independent, a woman who shaped her own destiny in an industry designed to control its stars. In the end, Katharine Hepburn's legacy is that of a trailblazer, not only in acting, where her performances set a standard of excellence, but also in how she lived her life. She refused to bend to societal norms, cultivating a persona that was both strong and enigmatic. While her romance with Spencer Tracy remains a dominant narrative, her deep connections with women and her refusal to embrace traditional femininity have led many to see her as a queer icon, even if she never claimed that identity herself. She may never have spoken her truth publicly, but in the way she lived, proud, independent, and unapologetically herself, Hepburn gave future generations permission to do the same. The studios may have spun her choices as eccentricities, but today they are recognized as the quiet markers of a woman who carved her own path, even when it meant keeping parts of herself hidden from the world. Mercedes Acosta was not a movie star in the traditional sense, but she was one of the most fascinating figures orbiting Hollywood's golden age. Born in New York City in 1893 to a wealthy Cuban family, she grew up in privilege and was drawn early to the world of art and literature. She became a poet, playwright, and screenwriter, but her true influence lay not in her professional accomplishments, but in the circles she moved in and the relationships she cultivated. With her dark, striking looks, sharp mind, and bold spirit, Mercedes became a fixture in the artistic and social elite, forging connections with some of the most celebrated women of her time. Her reputation as a lover of women was no secret in certain circles, and it became a defining thread of her legacy. She had relationships with several of the era's greatest stars, Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich among them. With Garbo, her connection was intense, passionate, and deeply complicated. Surviving letters from the Acosta to Garbo reveal a love that was ardent and desperate, filled with longing and devotion. Garbo, famously private, often pulled away, but their bond endured in cycles of intimacy and distance over many years. With Dietrich, too, Mercedes was said to have shared an affair, though their relationship was as much a clash of strong personalities as it was a romance. These liaisons earned her a reputation that both thrilled and unsettled Hollywood. Some admired her for her confidence and her refusal to live in the shadows. Others feared her, seeing her as a risk to the carefully constructed images of the actresses she loved. Columnist and writer Cecil Beaton reportedly referred to her as the most dangerous woman in Hollywood, a title that reflected how threatening her openness seemed in an industry built on secrecy. For studio executives, someone like Mercedes, bold, indiscreet, unwilling to disguise her passion, was a liability. Her writings provide some of the clearest windows into her heart. In her letters, Mercedes poured out her feelings without restraint, chronicling her love affairs in ways that left little doubt about their intensity and physicality. In an era when women were forced to speak in code, she wrote plainly, fearlessly, and unapologetically about her desire for women. These documents, preserved over time, have become invaluable in understanding not just her life, but also the hidden history of queer Hollywood. Unlike many women of her era, Mercedes did not carefully conceal her truth. She lived with a degree of openness that was rare and often dangerous. This refusal to hide cost her dearly. By the later stages of her life, she was ostracized from many of the glamorous circles she had once dominated. Friends turned away, lovers distanced themselves, and she became a figure of scandal rather than celebration. When she published her memoir, Here Lies the Heart, in 1960, it was met with outrage from many of her former companions, who accused her of betrayal for daring to write openly about relationships they had spent their lives concealing. But what damaged her reputation in her own time has made her a trailblazer in ours. Mercedes Acosta's refusal to remain silent ensured that a record of queer love in early Hollywood survived, even if it came to cost of her social standing. Today, she is recognized as one of the few who dare to live authentically in a world determined to erase women like her. She may not have had the fame of Garbo or Dietrich, but her courage and her passion left an imprint on all of them and on history itself. Her legacy is complicated, full of both triumph and tragedy. She was adored and vilified, embraced and rejected, yet in her determination to love openly, Mercedes Acosta became something larger than the gossip and scandal that once surrounded her. She became a pioneer, a woman who carved a space for queerness in a time when it was dangerous to even speak of it. And for that, she remains an icon. Alla Nazimova was one of Hollywood's first true visionaries, a woman who dazzled audiences on stage and screen while quietly rewriting the rules of what it meant to live authentically in an era of suffocating secrecy. Born in Yalta, Russia, in 1879, she trained as an actress under the great Konstantin Stanislavski before emigrating to the United States. By the time she reached Hollywood in the 1910s, Nazimova had already made a name for herself on Broadway, renowned for her intensity and artistry. On screen, she became a celebrated silent film star, known for her commanding presence and unconventional beauty. But her true impact went far beyond acting. She was also a producer, screenwriter, and creative force, bringing a bold, avant-garde spirit to Hollywood at a time when the industry was still finding its identity. One of her most famous works was the 1923 film Salome, a daring adaptation of Oscar Wilde's play. The project was entirely her vision. She produced it, starred in it, and surrounded herself with a circle of queer artists who helped bring it to life. With its striking Art Deco design and openly homoerotic undertones, Salome was decades ahead of its time. Though dismissed and misunderstood by critics in its day, it has since been recognized as a groundbreaking piece of queer cinema, one of the earliest films to embrace themes and aesthetics outside Hollywood's conventional boundaries. Nazimova's life off-screen was equally bold. She lived openly within private Hollywood circles as a woman who loved women, and her Beverly Hills estate became legendary. Known as the Garden of Alla, the property was famous for its wild parties, where queer artists, writers, and actors could gather away from the prying eyes of the press. More than just a social hub, it became a sanctuary for those who couldn't fully live their truths in public. Out of this world grew the so-called Sewing Circle, a loosely connected network of lesbian and bisexual actresses who found companionship and solidarity in one another. While the term was a euphemism designed to mask its true meaning, for those inside it, the Sewing Circle was a lifeline. Nazimova herself had affairs with several women, including writer Mercedes Acosta and actress Eva Le Gallienne. These relationships were known in artistic and social circles, even if the mainstream press never dared to print them. She was, in many ways, too independent, too unapologetic, and too unwilling to play the role Hollywood demanded of its women. Her refusal to hide, combined with her financial independence, made her a threat to the studio system, which relied on carefully controlled images of its stars. As the 1920s wore on, Nazimova's career began to decline. The failure of Salome financially crippled her, and her unwillingness to conform to Hollywood's rigid moral and artistic expectations left her increasingly sidelined. By the time talkies arrived, she was no longer the force she once was, though she returned to the stage and occasionally appeared in supporting film roles in the 1930s and 1940s. Still, she never regained prominence of her silent film years. Her story is tinged with both triumph and tragedy. On the one hand, she was a pioneer, a woman who refused to live in fear or compromise her identity, and who created art that pushed boundaries in ways Hollywood wasn't ready to accept. On the other hand, her openness and independence came at a cost, effectively cutting short a career that could have flourished under different circumstances. Today, Alla Nazimova is remembered not just as a silent film star, but as one of the earliest openly queer figures in Hollywood history. Her estate, the Garden of Alla, lives on in legend as a symbol of the secret queer culture of early Hollywood, a reminder of the hidden lives that pulse beneath the surface of the glamorous facade. Her legacy is that of a woman who dared to live truthfully in a time when doing so was both dangerous and revolutionary. Patsy Kelly never quite fit the mold of a traditional Hollywood star, and that was exactly what made her unforgettable. Born in Brooklyn in 1910, she carved out a niche for herself in the 1930s as a wisecracking, fast-talking comedian whose sharp humor and brash delivery made her a scene stealer in nearly every film she appeared in. She began her career on stage before moving into movies, where she became known for playing the comic sidekick or maid, often providing a dose of irreverence that undercut the glamour of the leading lady. While she never rose to the ranks of stardom occupied by contemporaries like Barbara Stanwyck or Katharine Hepburn, she brought an energy and honesty to her roles that made her a favorite among audiences who appreciated her humor and candor. Unlike many of her peers, Patsy Kelly was remarkably open about her personal life. She didn't dodge or disguise her sexuality. She admitted, plainly and without shame, that she was a lesbian. In interviews, she even spoke openly about her affairs with women, something that was virtually unheard of in Hollywood at the time. Most actresses lived under strict studio contracts with morality clauses, and even rumors of queerness could spell the end of a career. Kelly, however, seemed to take the opposite approach. She simply told the truth. This frankness was both refreshing and shocking, especially in the 1930s, when public discussions of same-sex relationships were considered scandalous. Her most famous liaison was with Tallulah Bankhead, the scandalous diva of stage and screen. While many of Bankhead's relationships with women were whispered about or hinted at, Kelly confirmed it outright, telling interviewers that she and Tallulah had been lovers. In doing so, she removed the veil of secrecy that surrounded so many Hollywood women's private lives. That honesty was groundbreaking, but it also came with consequences. Hollywood simply wasn't ready for an actress who would openly defy the carefully crafted illusions the studios depended on. Kelly's openness limited her opportunities in film. She was never cast as a leading lady, and as Hollywood tightened its grip on image-making in the late 1930s and 1940s, her career began to decline. Roles dried up, and she returned to the stage, where she continued to work in theater productions. Later, in the 1960s and 1970s, she found a second wave of success on television, appearing on shows like The Mary Tyler Moore Show and Bewitched, as well as in film comedies. Still, she never fully escaped the marginalization that her honesty had cost her in her early years. Yet, while she may not have achieved the stardom of her peers, Patsy Kelly held a unique place in Hollywood history. At a time when secrecy was the rule and authenticity was punished, she refused to pretend. Her straightforward humor extended to her personal life, and she treated her sexuality not as a shameful secret, but as a simple fact of who she was. That courage set her apart, even if it came at the expense of leading roles and enduring fame. Today, Kelly is remembered as one of the few actresses of her era who didn't just live her truth privately, but spoke it aloud. Her honesty makes her an important figure in queer Hollywood history, not because she was the most glamorous or the most successful, but because she was one of few who refused to play the game of concealment. In her brash, comic way, Patsy Kelly lived as herself, and that makes her legacy just as significant as any of the great stars she supported on screen. And Harding's story is one of grace, talent, and ultimately, erasure. Born Dorothy Walton Gatley in 1902, she rose to prominence in the late 1920s and early 1930s as one of Hollywood's most refined leading ladies. With her striking blonde hair, poised demeanor, and delicate yet commanding presence, she became the quintessential figure of elegance on screen. Harding specialized in portraying women of quiet strength, characters whose dignity and restraint resonated with audiences seeking sophistication in their entertainment. Films like Holiday in 1930, where she played opposite Mary Astor, and Peter Ibbetson in 1935, in which she starred alongside Gary Cooper, solidified her reputation as a performer who brought both intelligence and emotional depth to her roles. She was even nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress for a performance in Holiday, proof of just how seriously she was regarded in her prime. Harding's career was shaped by the demands of the early studio system, which prized image above all else. She was marketed as the epitome of refinement, an elegant, reserved woman who embodied idealized femininity. Off-screen, however, her personal life did not always fit the mold Hollywood wanted to present. She married actor Harry Bannister in 1926, and the two often worked together, both on stage and in films. But the marriage was fraught with tension, and they divorced in 1932. Afterward, Harding lived more privately, deliberately avoiding the limelight that so many of her contemporaries seemed to crave. It was during this period of her life that rumors began to swirl. Hollywood insiders whispered about Harding's close relationships with women, suggesting that her personal life was more complex than the carefully managed image studios projected. Unlike Tallulah Bankhead or Patsy Kelly, who embraced their wildness and even spoke openly about their affairs, Harding never confirmed nor directly confronted these whispers. Instead, she maintained a quiet dignity, neither playing to scandal nor loudly denying it. This discretion meant that much of her private life remains cloaked in speculation, with little concrete evidence. But the persistence of these stories suggests that Harding may have had relationships that the public could never fully know. Unlike stars whose flamboyance drew attention and gossip, Harding's style of queerness, if indeed the whispers were true, was subtle, restrained, and hidden in plain sight. This quietness both protected her and diminished her. She avoided the career-crippling scandals that befell other women who lived more openly. But in the process, her truth was buried beneath the carefully maintained image of refinement. She was not the scandalous diva, the rebellious icon, or the openly comic truth-teller. She was a dignified star who let mystery do the talking. Harding's career, unfortunately, did not sustain the momentum of her early success. By the late 1930s, her popularity waned as Hollywood's taste shifted and younger actresses emerged to fill leading lady roles. She continued acting in films and later on television, but never regained the stardom she had briefly enjoyed in the 1930s. In her later years, she withdrew even further from public life, living quietly until her death in 1981. Her legacy today is more subdued than that of her contemporaries, but remains important in its own way. Harding represents the many women of old Hollywood whose queerness was whispered about but never acknowledged, whose personal lives were veiled in secrecy, and whose stories risked being forgotten. If stars like Tallulah Bankhead and Mercedes de Acosta represented queerness in bold, unapologetic strokes, Harding embodied a quieter version, one that lived in rumor and silence, but still contributed to the hidden tapestry of queer Hollywood history. And Harding's story reminds us that not all secrets were scandalous headlines or flamboyant decorations. Some were whispered, subtle, and deliberately veiled, just as powerful in their presence as those shouted from the rooftops. She may not be remembered as vividly as some of her contemporaries, but her rumored truth adds another essential thread to the hidden history of Hollywood's golden age. The hidden history of old Hollywood is not just about the movies, the glamour, or the glittering premieres. It is also about the women who lived double lives, caught between who they were and who the world demanded them to be. Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Tallulah Bankhead, Barbara Stanwyck, Katharine Hepburn, Mercedes de Acosta, Alla Nazimova, Patsy Kelly, and Harding, and Joan Crawford were more than just legends on the silver screen. They were women who laughed, loved, and longed for authenticity in a time when the price of honesty could be the end of a career. They were human beings forced to hide a part of themselves, even as their faces lit up the world's biggest screens. Hollywood of the 1930s through the 1950s was built on fantasy. The studio system controlled every detail of an actor's life, what they wore, who they were seen with, what stories appeared in the press. Scandals were erased, relationships rewritten, and truths buried under glossy magazine spreads. In this world, queerness was not just considered taboo. It was considered dangerous. Rumors alone could destroy a star's reputation. So the studios worked tirelessly to protect their investments, ensuring that audiences saw only the carefully crafted illusion of perfect heterosexual stars and idealized marriages. But while the studios could hide the truth from the public, they could not erase it entirely. Letters survived, friendships endured, whispers passed through Hollywood's hidden circles. In private homes, at parties shielded from photographers, and within the secret network known as the Sewing Circle, these women found ways to live, to love, and to connect with each other, even if the world could never know. Today, their stories inspire us not because they were hidden, but because they survived. Despite the weight of silence and secrecy, their truths remain. Their courage was not always in standing on a stage and declaring who they were. It was in finding ways to be themselves in a world that demanded they be someone else. And their legacies remind us that queerness has always existed, even in the most tightly controlled corners of culture.